Welcome to the Audible Genius Podcast, where we take a behind-the-scenes look at being a musician. I'm Joe Hanley, and today I'm talking to Dave Spiers, the co-founder of G-Force Software. We'll be talking about what it's like creating software versions of classic synths, the evolution of synthesizers over the past decades, and how to utilize a drooling cat in film composition. Let's get started. So, Dave, your company G-Force, you guys take classic beloved synths and keyboard instruments, and these are usually things that are very expensive, hard to get your hands on. And you make software versions of them known as emulations, makes them way more accessible. Anyone can get their hands on these. And there are other companies that do this, but you guys are known for doing it particularly well, like really accurately. What's your approach? How do you get such a good result?
Lots and lots of time and lots of scoping and analysis, really. I don't think there's any shortcuts.
Is that analysis and scoping, is it like, are you using sort of visual analytical tools, or is it a lot of just sort of like using your ear and your own familiarity with how these things should sound?
There's kind of two stages, really. I think the first stage is obviously engineers scoping, looking at frequency responses, how different modules interact with other modules, just all of the component side of things. And then at a certain point, it comes to me, and I'm the bastard of the team. I'm like, right, I've got the original here, and then we just go through, and it's A, B, A, B, A, B. And then a lot of that, well, sometimes, quite often, that will then go back to engineers, and it's really just a case of kind of iterative refinements until we arrive at the destination.
So by scoping, you mean like, is that sort of an analytical like sort of exercise where they're like analyzing it in a visual sense?
Yeah. I mean, it's poke probe here.
Okay.
On every single component. At certain points, there may be some kind of spice emulation, which is, I'm not an engineer, so I can't talk about what they do other than they seem to do a pretty good job.
So they do the analytical part, they kick it over to you, and you do the musical part, and then there's kind of a back and forth iteration until it sounds right.
Yeah, and sometimes that can be very minimal. Other times, particularly when it comes to kind of adding new features that weren't on the hardware originals. Then there's a whole other discussion to be had about, does it fit within the ethos of the original instrument? Would they have done that? Had they had the tools back in the day? Have we overcooked it? In which case, then it's kind of right, remove things.
So it's not just about what you think today's musicians would need. It's also about respecting sort of the original intent of the instrument.
Absolutely. For us, respecting the intent and those who came before us is really, really important. Look, I'm old now, so part of the reason why we got into this was that I was a kid when Mini Moogs were out and Arp Odysseys were out, and a lot of these instruments I could never afford. So there was this kind of lust factor, and that, when we finally managed to get our hands on some hardware originals, we had to opt for the cheapest option, and they weren't in amazing shape. So then you're into restorations, and then you discover a lot about the choices they made. And that kind of led to, it was a kind of level of respect, I suppose. And then it was like, right, okay, so if we want this within a door, how can we do that?
That's interesting. That sounds like it must be kind of a fun, or a lot of work goes into it, but also maybe kind of a fun process.
Yeah. Some of it's, not fun. It's just slog. It's amazing. I was listening to this Lewis Cole track yesterday where he talks about being a million clicks away from the destination and so far away from the beginning that I've forgotten. And I don't know, that track really resonated with me. In fact, I was going to send it to the engineers because they would understand that way more than me.
So, with all this time you've been spending on making these emulations, does it just eventually turn into kind of a gut thing about what's right and what's wrong?
I think so, yeah. I mean, experience obviously, has counted for a bit over the years. We've also been really lucky to have had conversations with a lot of the originators. So you kind of get a feel for their character and kind of whether they were, a lot of old school engineers and actually a lot of modern engineers are quite insular characters. So you're trying to kind of coax, what was it that made you so driven to create an oscillator that stayed in tune? So there's all manner of backstories. So yeah, for me, that's as important as the kind of final product, really.
And so when you're kind of trying to get them to kind of reveal those sort of inner details, is it about like building a level of trust? Like they need to know that you're going to do right by them before they talk to you about these kinds of things?
Yeah, there's certainly that. I did one thing with Alan Perlman where I made a mistake when I asked him a question. It was basically about a company acquiring his company, and I got the companies the wrong way round. But actually, it was the best thing I could have done because what happened was, in correcting me, he just went into this really big monologue. And I'm kind of sat there going, brilliant. I hope we're recording all of this, recording all of this. So, yeah, it's coaxing things out. Actually, most engineers on a kind of one-to-one basis are very open. I think it's more when they get into groups of people that they tend to kind of retreat a little bit. So it's really just trying to bring that out.
Oh, that's interesting. And was that part of so you did a documentary called Bright Sparks, where you talked to a lot of these people that were involved in, the electronic, technology, sort of revolution, I guess you could say, the 70s, 80s, creating these amazing instruments. Was that conversation with Alan Perlman part of that?
Yeah, it was just stunning. He'd been persona non grata for quite a while. And it was a guy called Mark Vale who does the Vintage Synthesizers book. I'm just looking at it now. It's kind of my Bible. And Mark, I contacted Mark and asked him if he would be able to put me in touch or if he had contact details, and he put me in touch. We had some phone conversations, and eventually Alan, he was 89, just coming up to 90, and he was like, yeah, I'll talk to you. So we just got on a plane to Boston. And the whole project was just amazing. It started with there's a band in the UK called I Monster who way cooler than we could ever be, and they were doing this album that was dedicated to 8 electronic instrument pioneers, so 4 British, 4 American, and they'd seen my YouTubes, and in fact we were lending them hardware instruments so that the tracks that they were doing were truly authentic. And at one point Dean just said to me, I don't suppose you'd do a little video to kind of help us with the album. And actually, it reminded me of there was an occasion where I'd taken the back of our Mini Moog off to take to NAMM to get Bob to sign. And on the way to the airport, I realised I'd forgotten it and cursed on the coach. And Chris, my partner, said, don't worry, he'll be at Mesa. And he wasn't. And then obviously, we lost Bob. And it just really resonated with me at the time. I was like, we're starting to lose these people. And while their stories have been documented in text form, I just really liked the idea of people feeling like they were sat in the same room and getting a feel for their character, really. So, yeah, that was the start of it. It was amazing, amazing project for me to do.
And that was Bob Moog, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'd had conversations with Bob in the past, but yeah, I wasn't able to get his story because obviously he'd gone by the time we did Bright Sparks. But I did get his daughter, who runs the Moog Foundation, and Herb Deutsch, who was kind of his right hand man when they were developing the modular. Herb was kind of the more musical side of things, and Bob took care of the engineering. So yeah, just getting those people alone was amazing.
I watched the side A of Bright Sparks, and that part really stuck out to me, talking to Herb Deutsch, listening to someone who was, sitting next to Bob when they were making the first Moog modular and then the Mini Moog. And when I'd heard it before, I always thought it was interesting that, Bob was kind of against the idea of the Mini Moog, like simplifying it down into this keyboard instrument, though Herb seemed pretty enthusiastic about it. And those kinds of details are it's so helpful for people to hear that, like aspiring musicians to realize that some of these things were arguments before they became amazing things, or some of these things were sort of accidents.
Yeah. In fact, Will Gregory said at the time, a lot of these were punts. It was kind of like, oh, they're doing that. We should try this and we should try that. And I mean, the way the Mini Moog, arrived on the scene. I mean, I heard a brilliant story in that Bob had gone off kind of doing his lecturing rounds across the US, and manufacturing PCB boards was expensive. And they had a very early prototype Mini, but he kind of forbade everybody, it's like, do not get any PCBs made. But I think the engineers realized that unless they did this, the days of the company were numbered. So they did it. And then when Bob returned, he wasn't particularly happy about it. There was a lot of shoegazing that went on, I think. But I love that. It's just like somebody sees something, takes it, does something else with it, because it was all derived from the modular. And then it turns into this whole new thing, which really did revolutionize, the whole synthesis business.
Right, because before that, you had these big modulars, which were, they were like size of a wall, right? And extremely complicated, especially to someone who didn't know what they were doing, and extraordinarily expensive. So the Mini Moog changed everything by making it more accessible, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, like you say, they were the preserve of, the very wealthy. Academia as well. There were a lot in the universities and stuff over here. EMS was the kind of equivalent. Humongous great beast, the Synthi 100. And then gradually it was like, okay, how can we kind of democratize this? And once you get, I think for me, there's something so inclusive about the Mini Moog and the ARP Odyssey, in that, you can transport it, you can move it. Then people started using them at gigs. I mean, obviously you had Emerson and stuff doing things with the modular before, but they were really in a minority of 2 or 3.
And you mentioned the ARP Odyssey. You guys make an emulation of the Oddity, correct? And you just released an updated version of that. What kind of things did you change this time around?
Wow, a lot. Sonically, we kind of kept the essence. But what was fascinating was that was 20 years ago we did the original Oddity. So it's one of the first kind of VSTs out there. And it was amazing because, it kind of mirrored the hardware world in some ways, in that you could kind of do anything. Obviously, we were limited by CPU and stuff. But the one thing that really stuck out for me was kind of patch management, in that, with modulars, you had no memories. Then you had things like the 4-voice and the 8-voice, which had a very kind of archaic patch storage. And then things like the CS80. So the industry was sort of finding its feet really until the Prophet 5 came along and kind of defined everything that came thereafter. And the kind of we sort of happened upon the same journey, in that things like with the original Oddity, the patch management by modern standards was totally archaic. And now there is a kind of clear standard. So it was things like that. It was really addressing those things, bringing it into the 21st century.
I think musicians nowadays don't realize how good they have it. Like, if you want to get your hands on a synth, there's a million at your fingertips. You can just download one, thanks to companies like yours. But back in the day, like you just said, they didn't even have presets, more or less, right? And those early ones, you had to design every patch, you had to design it every time you wanted to use it, right?
Utterly stunning. I mean, for me, obviously in a studio environment, you've got the time, even though studio time was hideously expensive back then, but you had the time to really craft patches. I think the thing that really sticks with me is, for example, we've got that giant Oberheim 8-voice. Now, that was Chick Corea's, and when it turned up in the flight case, it was Chick Corea World Tour 1978, which I was like, whoa, amazing. But he toured with that. Now, every single one of those modules, if you want a uniform polyphonic sound, has to be tuned and set up identically. And the patch management storage is so archaic, it's almost non-existent. So for me, it was like, that's brave, taking something like that on the road. I mean, even an Odyssey, something as simple as an Odyssey, when you Herbie Hancock or Billy Currie, there's no A40 reference tone on that machine. So they would wrestle with those sliders. I mean, obviously the Mini Moog's slightly different because you've got the incremental knobs to adjust the footage of the octaves. But on the Odyssey, you haven't got that. And I saw Herbie Hancock was the kind of first gig I went to, and he's wrestling with the Odyssey and brought it back in tune after kind of going off on this out there tangent. And for me, that's kind of stuff of amazement, really.
So they essentially had to, like a guitar player, where they had to tune their synth as they went from city to city touring with it.
Yeah, and obviously the vagaries of analog electronics, each environment, the humidity is different, the tuning becomes different. I mean, it's just, yeah, chaos. Good techs, I think.
Okay. Right. Yeah, I suppose Herbie and Chick had that helping them out.
Yeah, definitely.
Nowadays you've got these elaborate systems, you've got computers involved. So if you're touring or you're playing live and you have tons of presets, you could just switch to sound to sound to sound with the push of a button.
Yeah.
You could do it in the middle of a song. But at that time, they couldn't do that. Was there any system by which they could just push a button to switch to a different song? Or is it literally had to turn all the knobs, set all the settings in the moment to switch to a different sound?
Not in the early days. I mean, it really was, okay, now this song requires this patch. And I think that's why you saw these huge keyboard rigs, because actually they'd kind of, I've worked with bands over the years on the road. So you would make sure that there was space in between this song, or if I played this song on this instrument, then I knew the next song would be on that, which would give me a little bit of time to kind of adjust that for the following song. So it was a kind of juggling act, not only playing, but also in kind of, just getting those patches right.
Wow.
And I also think that was one of the appeals of, some of the early kind of preset synths. If you think of something like the ARP Pro Soloist, it was a very simple preset synth. But here in the UK, it was adopted by people like Tony Banks. Very easy to switch between patches. What I find fascinating about that instrument is that in the UK, it was adopted kind of by the prog guys. In the US, it was adopted by the funk guys. So there was like the Ohio Players had a track called Funky Worm, which used the Pro Soloist. Well, the Funky Worm then went on to define hip hop and stuff. So out of this kind of, I wouldn't call it a novelty instrument because it's really cool, but out of a very simple instrument, either side of the Atlantic, it kind of spawned these two completely different things.
That's interesting. Do we have any idea why, or is it just kind of random chance that those bands happen to get their hands on those synths?
I think it was just because they were affordable and not complicated. I think it took a while before people kind of really immersed themselves in synthesis per se, and this was a kind of easy entry point. I mean, there was a lot. Roland's first synth was the SH1000 preset device. You had the Moog Satellite, which I think was actually made by an organ company, and then you had the ARP Pro Soloist. So there was a lot. It's basically a synth that you'd put on top of your organ or your Rhodes.
Now, a quick word for our listeners. Dave and I are talking about synthesizers. If you are interested in learning how to use a synth to make your own sounds, but you're not sure how to get started, or you've been trying and are struggling, which is common, I highly recommend Syntorial. It's a super effective course that we here at Audible Genius created that comes with a built-in synth that you'll make hundreds of sounds on as you go through the course. It starts at the very beginning, teaching you one control at a time, until before you know it, you're making great sounding synth patches by ear. Check it out at Syntorial.com. So, there were so many of these. How did you guys pick which ones you wanted to emulate?
The truth is, we started amassing a collection a while ago. Some of them, like I said before, were pretty in poor condition. Things like with the Odyssey, the sliders get very scratchy. They're quite difficult to source, some of the sliders now. So that became a kind of, I'm so in love with that instrument in the hardware form that it was like, I just want to keep using this. Maybe we could do this in software, and then the poor engineers suffer the wrath. But yeah, I mean, fundamentally, you have to have, with us, you just have to have that connection with the instrument.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to want to sit in front of it day after day trying to recreate the simulation. I imagine you had to listen to it and play with it a ton.
Yes.
Yes. Did you ever get to that point? Because I mean, if you spend enough time with something, even something you love, you sometimes start to kind of resent it or like, ugh. Was there any point where you're kind of like that love for the Odyssey started to wane because you were spending so much detailed time with it?
No, I don't think so. I mean, really, issues like that arise when you're adding additional things.
Okay.
And it's like with Odyssey 3, we put a distortion on it. Back in the day, a lot of Odyssey users would put it through a distortion pedal. And actually that spawned, in the UK, there was a synth called the Oscar, which had a drive circuit in, and the purpose of the drive circuit was to overdrive it so that a musician didn't have to take another pedal. So Billy Currie started on the Odyssey, and then he moved to the Oscar. But yeah, with us, it's really just trying. Yeah, that was a lot of head scratching, because it was like, we don't want it to be overkill. It has to be. It just has to fit within the ethos of how people used it back in the day.
Okay, that's cool. I love those stories about just technology being born from what musicians just happened to need at the time, like the need for presets or the common use of distortion added to a synth. Do you ever bring in other musicians to try out the emulations or just to see what they think and get their feedback?
Totally. It's kind of how we started. It's really funny, because we started with Mtron, which was the Mellotron emulation. And in fact, what happened was, we had this engineer working with us, and I wanted this this is like, we're going back to like 2000 now. So the very early days of the whole virtual studio technology. And I wanted something really elaborate, and I was asking too much. And then Chris and I were on a drive, and we were like, maybe we should start with something simple. And I had a load of Mellotron tapes from originals and a couple of artists that I'd worked with. And I just said, why don't we try? Why don't we just start on a virtual Mellotron? If you turn the pitch up, the tapes play faster, so you've got no complex pitch shifting algorithms or time stretch to deal with. And we got the engineer to make that. And then we had a couple of the old proggers come in and just play it. And they were like, well, this is kind of more reliable than my original. Maybe you should think about selling it. We had no plans to sell it at the time. But actually, based on their advice, we thought, yeah, let's try it. Because the whole industry was new and it seemed exciting at the time. And then we very quickly learned about support. That was an interesting learning curve, because we had no concept of, if it works great on my machine, it's going to work great on everybody's. And then the phone calls start coming in and the emails, and it's like, and then that led to a very pivotal moment where Chris, my partner, said, look, if we're going to do this, we should take it seriously. And that was the change for us.
Interesting. So at that point, were you selling it, or were you just kind of giving it to musicians to try out?
Yeah, no, we were selling it at that point,
Okay.
when the support started coming in. But prior to that, it was literally just kind of friends. Chris had worked with Wakeman and other people over the years. So it was really just kind of putting it in front of them, going, what do you think?
So when all these support requests started and you guys were like, okay, we need to make a change, what kind of changes did you need to make?
Just to be aware that just because it works on my computer doesn't mean it works on everybody else's. And yes, there was a lot of bug fixing and things like that to do in those days.
Got it. But once you got it together, then you were able to kind of put together sort of a system in place. Or was it just about having that expectation that you're going to get problems on different people's systems?
Yeah, I mean, we were completely naive. For us, it seemed like a really good idea to do on a wet Wednesday afternoon. Now let's sell this. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay. And also it's very different to hardware, because, hardware, you sell it, it ships, it goes out the door, and then you start working on the next thing. Whereas with software, it's there forever. And people go, I've got a new operating system, Apple. It doesn't work on my system. It needs an update. And so we were completely unprepared for that. But that really marked the change in, okay, yeah, let's kind of take this seriously.
And so what are your and Chris's roles in the company?
I guess I kind of do most of the creative stuff. I mean, the company's changed a lot in the last couple of years. Thanks to Jerome Munio, I know you spoke to. We kept thinking for years, if we get another year out of it, it might be fun. And then another year and another year. And eventually you kind of hit a certain age and it's like, oh, okay, this is actually taken up quite a significant portion of my life. And thankfully, Chris has always overseen the money. But he also has a very kind of matrix-like brain. I'm very good at the grand gestures. We should do this. Why don't we do this? And Chris kind of drills down into the detail and goes, well, if we do that, then the implication will be that. And he manages the finances forensically. If I can't do money. I'm completely numerically dyslexic. That's my excuse anyway. And I'm sure that if I managed the money, we'd have been bankrupt within a week of starting.
I'm glad you have that partner then.
Yeah, me too.
When you guys butt heads, is that kind of where you butt heads? Like you have the idea, and he's sort of whether he determines whether it can be executed financially or not.
Yeah.
Does that ever create friction there?
Do you know, it's amazing. We've had one argument in 22 years.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely mind blowing. And actually, that was after we'd come back from Alan Perlman's and we were in the restaurant and we were about to release Oddity 2, weirdly enough. And I was a little concerned about the patch management system, oddly enough. And we'd had such an amazing day. I think I'd labored the point a little bit too hard. And Chris was just like, shut up. And we both kind of stormed off. But we've just kind of communicate via telepathy. It's a very strange, for me, there've been a few musicians in my life that I've managed to communicate via telepathy with. You know what's going on in their head. You can kind of anticipate where they're going to in the changes and what the groove should be and whatnot. And with Chris, it's been the same, but in business. I've been really lucky, actually.
Yeah. How'd you guys originally connect?
Oh, wow. It's a hideous story. We were both at school together. We didn't know each other. We knew of each other. We weren't mates. We both left that school kind of midway through to go to another school, kind of private school. Me, because my father thought I needed a bit more discipline. I don't know what Chris's story was. We both ended up in the kind of same house. Again, knew of each other, didn't hang out together. We both left there, went into the motor trade for a very short period of time. Again, bumped into each other, didn't know each other. And then we met because Chris had toured with a ton of bands during the 80s and basically the 80s, while I was struggling with, playing in bands and trying to get, working with shitty deals and all that kind of stuff. And then he had worked with a guy who's now in the US called Julian Colbeck, who did these Keyfax books, which is basically a guide to every synth ever made. And then Chris quit the industry after a particularly arduous Yes tour, I think it was. And at the same time, I met Julian. So I kind of filled Chris's shoes for that. And that's kind of how we met. And then we both were like, he was looking at getting out of the business that he'd just sold. And I needed somebody to do my taxes. And we ended up doing, we worked for a while with Julian. We did a little controller thing called the Fat Boy. It was kind of one of the first MIDI controllers. And then we just kind of looked at each other after a while and went, but there were things that we wanted to do that kind of didn't fit within the Keyfax thing. So it was like, yeah, let's just do this.
So it sounds like he was really looking to get out of performing. How's that transition for you, going from like performing to working in like business and technology?
Oh, bliss. I mean, I toured Chris was a tech. I was more of a player. I noticed that most people who stayed on the road for any real length of time ended up divorced. Their kids hated them and they became addicted to life on the road. I was fortunate in that I saw that quite quickly. And also when the first Gulf War came along in 91, that decimated the touring industry. Artists were too frightened to fly. Then over here, we had a huge recession. Ticket prices were too expensive. So for me, that was the kind of perfect opportunity to go. We kind of miss it. There are days when you miss it because there's a lot of fun. And most of those rock and roll stories you hear are generally true. But then in the real world, as you get older and your back starts creaking and stuff, and it's just like, yeah, I don't know. Anyway, I've remained married, so yeah, I'm happy.
Congratulations. Yeah, a similar experience. I toured a little bit, not nearly as much as it sounds like you guys did. But at one point I realized, oh yeah, this is a lifestyle of its own, and I don't want to do this for the long haul. It seems like you had to really love it to want to do it your whole life.
I have massive respect for people who just have done it for, like 20, 30 years. In fact, there's a good friend of mine He started with Susie and the no Magazine. Did Pills, Susie and the Banshees, The Fix. Had been with Underworld for like 20 something years. Is now 60 something. And then when that all ended with the whole lockdown and COVID stuff, he was like, he said, I'd ridden out every recession that had happened. You know, it kind of hadn't touched me with the bands that I was working with. But now he said, I'm kind of 60 something. I don't really know any other life.
Wow.
And I'm like, wow, okay, yeah.
So one of the first businesses you worked with, Keyfax Software, you made these twiddly bits.
Yeah.
You called them MIDI recordings. And nowadays we probably refer to them as MIDI loops, MIDI packs. And how musicians use them now, you just download them, drag them into your DAW, and boom, you get notes to play your instrument. But this was, I want to say, early 90s.
Yes.
So, DAWs weren't pervasive yet. No one really had them or was using them. So who was buying these MIDI recordings and what were they using them for?
It's kind of fascinating in that Julian was reviewing stuff for Sound on Sound magazine and things, and actually done his back in. So it was literally like, tell me how this works. So I'd kind of tell him all the technical stuff, and then he'd put it into really good prose. And then there was one occasion where he had a bunch of Richard Clayderman song MIDI files. And he said, go away, tell me what these are like. And I just came back the following day and said, I can't tell you anything about this. This is like everything I hate about electronic music. It's soulless, lifeless. And his question was, is it because the person who's programmed these has done it without any emotion or without any sensibility of the instrument? I mean, obviously it was just a piano. And he'd just finished the ABWH tour, another incarnation of Yes. And he was like, so what if we put Bill Bruford on MIDI drums and recorded his licks? And there was an amazing guitarist on that ABWH tour called Milton McDonald, who's now with ELO and stuff, a phenomenal player. What would it be like if we gave him a MIDI guitar? So we kind of started it as an experiment, and then I was working with a producer and I used some of the guitar licks with the kind of S750, like really nice guitar samples. And of course, because RAM was really expensive, samplers were really expensive. Like you say, not everybody was into, well, certainly hard disk recording wasn't really a thing back then. The idea that you could take these kind of MIDI snippets of somebody giving a good performance, doing all the stuff that you can't do on a keyboard because you don't have that sensibility, being able to transpose it, change the tempo, change individual notes.
Okay.
It was like I was working on these amazing kind of gay high energy disco tracks that were kind of cover versions of like the hits, but all at 160 BPM with octave bass lines. And I put these guitar loops in, and the producer, these guitar MIDI bits in with decent guitar samples, and the producer was like, what is that? And I'm like, oh, it's this guy Milton. And then it just kind of got legs. But yeah, I mean, it was amazing because we just put an advert in the back of Sound on Sound, send a postal order to a PO box, and people did. And yeah, it was kind of hobbyist, and then it got a reputation, and then pros started. I still get people send me tracks where they've used certain parts, and what's funny is it takes me a while because I'm like, I know that riff. Oh, it's that. Okay, yeah, it's really flattering actually.
So before you were making these, there was other people doing it, but they weren't very musical. But you guys had the idea to actually grab some drummers, some people played the instruments, and record what they were doing and turn that into MIDI.
Yeah, it was crazy. I mean, we had things like MIDI pedal steel.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there was a guy in the US, Scott Joss, amazing player. MIDI. I mean, it's just like MIDI everything. And I love that whole alternative controller thing because, it makes you think in a different way. And again, the sensibility of let's say a MIDI brass, brass player is, sax solos on a synth sound horrible. A sax solo played on a MIDI wind instrument with the articulation and the sensibility of a real sax player transposed onto a synth or even a sax sample can sound quite good.
Okay.
And then you get into the whole thing, because it's simply MIDI data, we can assign it to any sound we want.
Now, for our listeners, making a MIDI loop is essentially composing a very small piece of music, like a bass line or a drum pattern. But instead of writing it down on a piece of sheet music, you're creating it inside music recording software known as a DAW, allowing what you've written to play itself. If this is something you want to learn how to do, I highly recommend another super effective course of ours called Building Blocks. It'll take you step by step through the process of writing the building blocks of beats, like drum patterns, bass lines, chord progressions, and melodies. And it all takes place in an actual online DAW where you create music as you go. Check it out at audiblegenius.com. If there weren't, DAWs to load these onto to trigger the instruments, how'd you sell them? Like you sell them on like hard disks or something like
Oh,
that?
they were floppies.
Floppy disks.
Yeah, I mean, it was a floppy and a CD dual case. It's so funny because somebody said to me at one point, he saw me with a bunch of floppies and he was like, I use those as drinks coasters.
Right.
I was like, yeah, we make money out of them.
For those who are listening who don't know what a floppy disk is, nowadays we're just used to downloading something off the internet, but you had to actually ship something on a piece of hardware to then put into your computer. Yeah, and they were literally floppy. I remember my dad having those in the office, and yeah, they literally would flop around. They're just almost like a soft plastic sort of.
Amazing.
And so
Amazing.
you load those into the synths, like the synths at that time you could actually put the disc directly into.
Yeah, I mean, you could load them into hardware sequencers, MC500, Rolands and stuff. But I mean, this was the early days of Cubase and stuff. In fact, what we did was we did a kind of template where everything was on a Cubase timeline and tracks.
Got it.
So you could just mute and demute and then drag the little sliver to where you wanted it in your own composition. Okay. So yeah, there was kind of early doors out there.
Okay, interesting. Now, when you're not working with GeForce, you do other things. Obviously, you've done a lot of stuff. One thing you do is sound design work, and one particular one I was reading about was doing sound design for a movie that involved Peter Gabriel, where they wanted you to create sounds that confused your ear as to whether they were synthetic or organic. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. It was a guy called Richard Evans, who was in Peter's band at the time, a guitarist, amazing guitarist alongside David Rhodes. I think he'd worked with Peter for quite a long time. And he approached me. Peter had this deal with National Geographic. And I think this thing was called Sea Monsters. Anyway, it was a huge IMAX super experience. And Richard had heard some things I'd done before and kind of said, look, actually, what we really want to do is confuse the listener as to whether it's synthetic or organic. In fact, what he said to me is scare 12-year-olds. And I was like, I can do that. I don't need audio to do that. But it was a really, I have not seen it. I don't know what was used, if anything. I just kind of did my piece, handed it over to him because they were doing the whole score and obviously it had to integrate with that. It was it was in between Foley and music. And I liked that little niche kind of climbing in there. So yeah, it was things like, to use Melodyne with, I don't know, Animal, I kind of recorded my cat purring and stuff like that, put it in Melodyne, transpose it down, layer it with something else. And it's kind of what led to a synth we did with iZotope. I was called Iris, but at the time I had a sound in my head that I really wanted. It was very kind of band limited. Actually, it was amazing because I couldn't get this sound. I just couldn't get it. No matter how much I processed things, I just could not get it. And I went into my living room slightly frustrated, and there was this Honda advert on the TV. And I was like, that's what's in my head. So I called Carl from Underworld. In fact, I Googled it, like who did the score, who did the sounds for this, and it was John Hopkins. So I knew John had worked with Carl, and Carl knew John. So I called Carl and said, "Can you put me in touch with John?" And then I called John and just went, "How did you do that?" And he was very gracious and told me how he did it. And actually, it wasn't synthesis; it was what was he using? It was like a sound forge or something, but it was violins. So you had these really defined kind of frequencies. and gaps in between. It just sounded to me, it just sounded amazing. And that I've been using Isotope's RX kind of noise reduction software where you can kind of lasso certain uh, harmonics. And that's when we went to Isotope and went, have you ever thought about turning this into a synth?
So you would take organic sounds like a cat purring, and you would carve out part of it, in a sense, and then
Yeah.
layer it in with maybe a synth or some other instrument.
Yeah, some effects or maybe even another animal. So if you take, for example, cat purring and then you just transpose it down and just take that kind of low frequency.
Okay.
And then if you layered that with some, I don't know, like a dribbling human,
Okay.
and then take certain frequencies of that, you can kind of layer them to sort of build this other thing.
And you set that up in a sampler and then deliver it to the composers for the movie, and then they would take it and make music with it.
Yeah, they would give me kind of because it was all animation. So they would give me the kind of wireframe stuff and go, we want something for this. And then I'd kind of do what I do. It's quite amusing in that, you know, most of the things I've done for other people, I've never seen. I've never seen the movies, so I don't know what was used. They probably got it and just went, what is this shit? And threw it out. But I got paid.
Yeah, right. It sounds like it was a fun project. You get to kind of exercise your musical mind doing something like that.
Totally. It was yeah, no, I love all of that side of things. You know, the time constraints were pretty savage on occasion.
Okay. Right. Is it always that specific, or are there ever times where, like you made a bunch of presets for Novation's line of synths, the Summit and Peak? Were they also specific about what kind of patches they want, or do sometimes they just like, hey, make 100 patches, do your thing?
Yeah, that was kind of the deal with them. It was like, right, we need 128 patches and whatnot. Again, fascinating because you get something before it's released, and then you get to dive deep into it. And kind of, I like finding the nooks and crannies. But my real philosophy with it, you know, doing patches for synths is it has to feel like it has to feel right. It was kind of interesting because I did Summit at the same time as Peak, and Peak was obviously the box with knobs on. So it's a very different mindset when you approach sound design with a box with knobs on. You know, you could do effect stuff. It kind of it felt like it gravitated to that. Whereas when there's a keyboard on it, the velocity's it's just got to feel right. The dynamics, it's about the feel. In fact, I had a synth company guy came up to me last week maybe, and he said, you're the only person on the videos you do who ever talks about feel. And I was like, oh, I didn't know. I had no idea. But for me, yeah, it's massively important.
So with the Summit, the one that had the keyboard attached to it, you'd be playing the keyboard as you'd be programming the sound. With the Peak that had no keyboard attached to it, what were you doing to hear the sound as you were programming it?
I'd still attach a keyboard to it, but it's really just a different mindset. You know, you kind of it was more exploratory, I suppose, with Peak.
That's interesting.
Whereas with Summit, I was like, I want this to feel like I want that feedback because, you know, so many different controller keyboards have a different feel to them. They have a different velocity curve, or they're weighted differently, or the aftertouch is different. It's like, you know, you almost feel like you need to put an explainer out there. Like, I use this keyboard when I program the patches on this instrument, but you can't do that. So yeah, if it's a box with knobs on, you gravitate to something slightly different.
That's cool. So what's next for you? Do you have anything new coming on the horizon, or things you want to explore?
Yeah, there's a lot going on within the company, which is good, which I'm not allowed to talk about because every time I talk about things, they're allowed to beat me around the head with an old school telephone directory until I pass out. Because in the old days, I used to kind of get overexcited and go, yeah, we're working on this. And then something would happen and it would delay it.
Right.
And then customers would get frustrated, and then they would pass that frustration on to the engineers. So in the end, it was just like, okay, don't talk.
I can relate to that. I do the same thing with my company. I talk about it too early, and then of course there's feature creep, and I want to start adding things and all that business. Well, Dave, thank you so much for joining me. It's been fascinating, kind of just listening to how things have changed throughout the history and all the different things you've been doing.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and good luck with the Oddity 3 launch.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Audible Genius podcast. Now, as you listen to these musicians' stories, you may find yourself wanting to make your own music. Or maybe you already can, but you feel the need to brush up on fundamentals, fill in some gaps. Well, I've got some super effective and engaging courses that help aspiring digital musicians find their voice and create music they love. And these courses are more than just a series of videos. They have interactive challenges in a music software environment where you actually create music as you go and get real experience. The first course I recommend is Building Blocks, where you'll learn beat composition and music theory in an online music studio. Check it out at audiblegenius.com. We also have Syntorial, an award-winning course on synthesis, where you'll learn how to create your own sounds with a synthesizer. Check that out at syntorial.com. And both of these courses are designed by yours truly and the team here at Audible Genius. So if you've ever had a desire to make your own music, I highly encourage you to check them out. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode.